This is true echo, where real courage meets quiet strength, and where stories of dignity, injustice, and redemption echo through the lives of those who refuse to stay silent. Today's story isn't just about a man or a moment. It's about a nation still learning how to respect the people who sacrificed everything for it. One black Navy SEAL walks into a bar, and what follows will leave you speechless. Watch closely, because this isn't just a story. It's a reckoning. The Salty Gull sat at the edge of Port City's main harbor, nestled between the docks and the weather-worn bait shops that smelled of old salt and motor oil. Inside, it was dim, filled with the sound of clinking glasses and murmured conversations, just loud enough to keep secrets but quiet enough for the regulars to hear themselves drink. At the far end, a man sat alone in the corner. His beer untouched, hands resting on the table, back straight, eyes calm. That man was Jerome "Jax" Mallister. To the strangers in the bar, Jax looked like a drifter, frayed baseball cap, worn gray t-shirt, faded jeans, and cold steel-gray eyes that barely blinked. What they didn't see were the scars beneath his shirt, the memories stitched into his silence, or the storms he had survived. Jax wasn't just any man, he was an ex-SEAL, 15 years of classified operations and near-death missions burned into his bones. And all he wanted that day was peace. A beer. And silence. But silence, to some, is more threatening than noise. Behind the bar stood Frank Delaney, a man as wide as he was loud. He liked things his way, simple, predictable, and white. The Salty Gull wasn't listed in travel guides or Yelp's top picks, but it didn't need to be. It had its regulars, and Frank liked it that way. When Jax walked in and took a seat without speaking, Frank watched him like a hawk. Didn't matter that Jax hadn't caused trouble, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even sipped his beer. What mattered was the look. The calm, unreadable, unbothered stillness. And the color of the man wearing it. Frank walked from behind the bar, his boots stomping like a warning shot. "You got the wrong place," Frank said coldly. Jax looked up. "I haven't even finished my first drink." "And you won't," Frank said, pointing to the door. "Take your money somewhere else. The kind of person you are isn't welcome here." The bar went silent. Forks paused mid-air. Jax didn't flinch. He knew this kind of confrontation, just not from the enemy. He lifted the beer glass, not to drink, but to steady his breathing. He exhaled, slow and even. "I've been called a lot of things," Jax said. "But never too loud while staying silent." Frank leaned in, breath heavy with cigar smoke and bourbon. "You're watching everything. Like you're planning something. That makes me, and my customers, uncomfortable." "No," Jax replied, his voice low. "I'm just drinking beer. And thinking about things I never say out loud." That was the last straw for Frank. With a sneer and a loud grunt, he waved him off like swatting a fly. "I got the right to refuse service to anyone," Frank said, his voice carrying across the room. "This is my place." Jax stood slowly. He adjusted the chair. Left the beer untouched. His eyes scanned Frank one last time, not in fear, but with surgical precision. Like a man memorizing every feature of a face for a mission briefing. And then he walked out. No threats. No shouting. Just silence. But when a SEAL stays silent, it isn't surrender. It's a warning. Jax's boots echoed against the harbor pavement as he walked away from the Salty Gull. The gulls above him cawed with indifference, and the scent of saltwater and rust mixed with the bitter aftertaste of humiliation. But it wasn't the first time Jax had been made to feel like he didn't belong, only now, it wasn't behind enemy lines or in the murky heat of a foreign desert. It was here. Home. In a place he had fought to defend. He turned down a side street, pulled out his phone, and opened the secure app, Ghost Pack. The group chat hadn't been used since their last team reunion 9 months ago. There were no memes, no random birthday wishes. This chat wasn't for that. It was for calls that didn't need explanation. He typed. Salty Gull, Port City. Owner, Frank Delaney. Refused service. Black soldier. No conflict. No words. Just prejudice. FYI. No reply needed. He stared at the message. His thumb hovered over the send button for a moment. Not because he second-guessed himself, but because he knew what it meant to send it. Then he pressed it. In a garage 2 states away, Logan Reaper Rhodes was oiling his shotgun when his smartwatch vibrated. The notification popped up with the Ghost Pack skull icon, simple, gray, and sharp. He read the message once. That was all he needed. He stood up, wiped his hands, and walked to the fridge. His fiancée called from the living room, "Everything okay, babe?" Reaper paused, looked down at his boots, then back toward the hallway. "Yeah," he said. "Just gotta go see an old friend." In less than 15 minutes, 6 other former SEALs got the same notification. No one replied. No one asked, what happened? They didn't need to. All they saw was the phrase, "Black soldier, refused service." And that was enough. Across North Carolina, Florida, Texas, and even Illinois, phones lit up and maps were pulled. Bricks canceled his date. Smoke stepped away from his barbecue. Viper left a family dinner with nothing but a nod to his wife. Twitch, Maddox, Hawk, Steel, Razor, and Echo all moved like clockwork, every man knowing the drill without saying a word. Because when one of theirs sent up a flare, there was only one response. Mobilize. Meanwhile, in Port City, Frank Delaney sat in the back office of the Salty Gull, watching the bar's security footage, not because he feared anything would happen, but to feel righteous. To him, Jax had been a problem avoided. Frank muttered aloud to no one in particular, didn't cause trouble, but you could tell. Quiet types are always watching. I know his kind. His bartender, Rick, knocked and stuck his head in. Hey Frank, that guy from yesterday, you think he's coming back? Frank scoffed. If he knows what's good for him, he won't. But Jax wasn't coming back alone. And not for revenge. For clarity. For justice. For every silent man who had ever been judged for merely existing. That night, Jax didn't sleep. He lay on his back in the small motel bed just 6 blocks from the bar, the air conditioner rattling above him. He stared at the ceiling, hands folded over his chest, his breathing slow and measured. His thoughts weren't about retaliation. They were about memory. About a conversation from years ago. A young recruit once asked him in Somalia, "Chief, how do you stay so calm when people treat you like crap back home?" Jax had replied, "Because I'm not here for their approval. I'm here for my brothers. And one day, the silence will speak louder than the shouting ever could." That day was coming. The next morning, the street outside the Salty Gull was quiet. The fishing boats were pulling in, seagulls hovered in loops above the harbor, and the old wooden sign creaked in the breeze. Frank was inside restocking the bar, grumbling about prices and supply chains, when the front door creaked open. He looked up casually. What he saw stopped his breath. One by one, they entered. 12 men, each one tall, broad-shouldered, and calm. They didn't walk like customers. They didn't smile. They didn't speak. But their presence hit the room like a pressure wave. Frank's stomach tightened before his brain had a chance to catch up. His hand froze mid-reach for the bourbon bottle. They wore no uniforms. No medals. But their eyes, those eyes had seen things Frank could never comprehend. Leading them was Reaper. Sunglasses. Black jacket. Silent as a grave. He stepped to the center of the room. The others spread out, each man claiming a position without asking permission. Tank stood near the entrance. Smoke and Bricks flanked the bar. Doc calmly walked to the far end and opened a leather case. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out an iPad. Frank blinked. Gentlemen? Reaper stepped closer. I don't need a drink, he said, his voice low and surgical. I need you. Frank took a step back, confused. If this is about last night, I have the right. You have the right, Reaper nodded, removing his sunglasses. You don't have immunity. Frank's throat tightened. This isn't about lawsuits or violence, Reaper continued. This is about something you don't understand, Frank. And we came to explain it. Tank grunted, the deep sound bouncing off the walls like the rumble of a distant storm. Frank stumbled over his words. I didn't do anything wrong. The guy made people uncomfortable. He had a weird vibe. Wrong answer, Doc said from the corner. Try again. Brick stepped forward and placed a photo on the bar. A candid image of Jax carrying a bleeding soldier through the rubble, his face calm, his body covered in dust and blood. You kicked out that man, Reaper said, stepping forward. And now, you're going to learn something you should have known a long time ago. Frank stared at the photo on the bar as if it had burned itself into his retinas. The image of Jax carrying a wounded soldier, his arms wrapped around another man's life like it was sacred cargo, shattered the narrative Frank had been repeating to himself since the previous night. He wasn't just some quiet stranger in a bar. He was someone who had carried others through hell. I didn't know, Frank stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of what surrounded him. That's the problem, Reaper said, his tone sharper now. You didn't care to know. You saw his skin and his silence, and that was enough for you to pass judgment. Tank stepped forward. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His sheer presence was a wordless threat, not of violence, but of moral reckoning. Behind him, Smoke leaned against the jukebox, arms crossed, his gaze drilling holes through the back of Frank's neck. Reaper continued. We're not here to tear down your bar. We're not here for payback. We're here because the world doesn't get to keep pretending that respect is optional. You put that flag behind your bar, Frank. You tell people you support the troops. But when one of us walks in, you throw him out like garbage. Frank swallowed hard. It wasn't personal. It didn't feel right. That feeling you had? Doc asked, stepping up beside Reaper, is what we spent our lives fighting against. That feeling kills people. That instinct of, he doesn't belong, that's the same thing that's left our brothers dead, unemployed, or drinking themselves into silence because they're tired of explaining their worth. Reaper raised a hand slightly, signaling the others. Tank, Viper, Hawk, and Maddox moved toward the bar, not threatening, but imposing. Not one word was spoken, but their alignment sent a clear message: this wasn't about fear. It was about correction. I have customers, Frank said weakly. I have a business to run. You had a community, Reaper corrected. And last night, you showed them what kind of community this is. One where silence gets punished. One where dignity gets labeled as threat. Frank's eyes darted toward the door as if seeking a way out. But there wasn't one. The only path forward now was through accountability. Doc slid the iPad closer to Frank, revealing not only the photo but also video footage, security cam footage from the street. It showed Jax walking in. Sitting down. Doing nothing. Then Frank approaching. The confrontation. And Jax walking out, silent. Is that your definition of a threat? Doc asked. Frank didn't answer. We're not here for an apology, Reaper said, his voice quieter now, deeper. We're here for a change. You're going to apologize, yes. But not just with words. With action. And you're going to do it not because we forced you, but because the part of you that still wants to be a man, not just a bar owner, understands that. Frank's voice was barely audible. What do you want me to do? Reaper didn't answer right away. He walked around the bar slowly, deliberately, as if inspecting the walls of a building about to be rebuilt from its foundations. "You're going to call Jax," Reaper finally said. "Right now. And you're going to say the words you never thought you'd have to say to a man like him. Not because you got caught. Not because we're standing here. But because you finally see who he is." Frank hesitated. He might not pick up. "He will," Reaper said. "Because the kind of man Jax is. He doesn't leave people behind. Even the ones who don't deserve it." With trembling fingers, Frank reached for the phone. He looked at the men surrounding him. He looked at the photo. Then he dialed. 1 ring. 2. Then, Mal Lister. Frank froze. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Bricks stepped forward. "Say it." Frank swallowed. "Mr. Mal Lister, this is Frank Delaney. I'm the owner of the Salty Gull. I treated you horribly last night. I made a mistake. A deep, ugly one. I didn't see you. I saw a fear I didn't understand, and I let that speak for me." The silence on the other end of the line was unbearable. For a moment, Frank thought Jax might just hang up. But then Jax's voice came, steady and calm. "Keep talking." Frank's throat tightened. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. But I want you to know. I see it now. And I want to make it right. I've never felt smaller than I do right now, and maybe that's what it takes to start seeing people as they are." The call went quiet again. Reaper didn't blink. The others didn't move. Then Jax replied, "I hear you. But this isn't about you feeling small. It's about whether you'll stay small or grow out of it. I'll drop by. Not for the drink. For the principle." Click. Frank set the phone down slowly. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. "Good," Reaper said. "Now you'll do 3 more things." Frank looked up, eyes wide. 1. You'll post a public apology. No excuses, no euphemisms. Just the truth. 2. You'll donate $10,000 to the Navy SEAL Foundation, in Jax's name. 3. Reaper paused. You'll learn how to serve a man with dignity, not beer. And you'll prove it when he walks back in. Frank blinked. $10,000. That's. Reaper stepped forward. Cheap compared to what Jax gave this country. There was no arguing that. Doc opened the donation page on the iPad. "We'll help you fill it out. But your hands better not shake when you press submit." And so, Frank Delaney, who once believed he owned his bar like a throne, now sat behind his counter submitting a donation with 12 silent soldiers watching, not to shame him, but to make sure that what was broken, truly began to heal. The payment screen blinked once before confirming. Transaction successful, $10,000 donated to the Navy SEAL Foundation. In honor of Jerome, Jax, Mal Lister. Frank Delaney stared at the glowing screen like he had just signed away a piece of his own history. But it wasn't guilt that weighed his shoulders down, it was the knowledge that, for the first time in his life, he had been forced to confront the mirror of his character, and the reflection staring back had not been a man of dignity, but a man of excuses. Doc leaned over and printed the receipt. Without a word, he folded it and handed it to Tank, who tucked it into the pocket of his tactical jacket, not as a threat, but as a reminder. They all knew, words faded. Paper could be lost. But memory was carved into bone. Now the public apology, Reaper said, nodding toward the phone on the bar. Socials. All of them. Frank nodded slowly. He unlocked the bar's Instagram and Facebook pages, hands trembling. Reaper watched him closely, not for grammar, but for sincerity. Frank began typing. I, Frank Delaney, owner of the Salty Gull, offer my deepest apology to Mr. Jerome Mallister, a decorated Navy SEAL veteran whom I disrespected and cast out based on nothing but my own prejudice. My actions were shameful. They do not represent the values I claim to hold, nor do they represent what this community should stand for. I will do everything in my power to ensure this bar becomes a place of true respect and honor for those who've served, and for anyone who walks in seeking peace. I am sorry. Truly. He paused before posting. Is this, right? Reaper didn't smile. You'll know it's right when it hurts to say it. Frank nodded. Then he hit post. Outside, the sea breeze picked up. The flag on the pole flapped again, not with pride, but with a kind of solemn humility. For years, it had hung as a backdrop. Now, finally, it stood for something real. Inside, the ghost pack didn't clap. Didn't cheer. Didn't even speak. They stood where they had been, solid, unmoving. Like the walls of an old fortress finally being rebuilt from the inside. Briggs checked his phone. It's up. Already getting shared. Doc added, no turning back now. Frank leaned against the bar, as if his body was slowly deflating. But he didn't collapse. Not yet. What now? He asked. Reaper tilted his head. Now you wait. For what? For the man you disrespected, to walk back in and see if this place, and you, are worth stepping into again. And then, without fanfare, the ghost pack moved. Slowly. Silently. 12 men, each one forged in war, each one carrying the same unspoken oath, we don't leave our own behind. They walked to the door as one. No words. No nods. But the weight of their presence left behind a silence louder than any sermon. When the last one, Steele, closed the door, Frank felt as though the oxygen had returned to the room, but not the comfort. He stood there behind the bar, staring at the glass he'd been drying for half an hour. And for the first time, he didn't feel like the owner. He felt like the student. The day passed slowly. Customers trickled in and out, many staring at Frank's public apology on their phones. Some avoided eye contact. A few asked quietly if the post was real. He only nodded. That night, Frank didn't sleep. He sat in the back office with a fountain pen and a blank sheet of paper. No email. No social media. Just ink. Just a man trying to find the words to do more than just save face, to ask for something greater, forgiveness. He wrote. Jerome. I'm not writing to erase what I did. I'm writing because I finally understand what it means to carry the weight of a moment. You came into my place in peace. I answered with cowardice. I saw your skin before I saw your silence. Your eyes before your story. And I was wrong. If you ever decide to return, I won't greet you as a customer. I'll greet you as a man I once wronged, and will spend every day trying to honor. Frank Delaney. He folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and placed it beneath the counter at the exact spot Jax had once rested his untouched beer. No fanfare. No instructions. Just waiting. The next afternoon, just as the sun began to dip and the harbor turned gold with light, the door creaked open. Jax walked in. The room fell silent, not out of fear, but out of reverence. He wore the same frayed cap, same gray shirt. But today, his eyes carried a different weight, not anger, not even curiosity. Just quiet calculation. Frank was already waiting. Not behind the bar. Not in the office. But standing at the center of the room like a man prepared to give his final defense. When Jax approached his old seat, Frank didn't say a word. He moved around him, pulled out the chair, and stepped back, not like a host, but like a servant acknowledging someone who had every right to take up space. Jax sat. Slowly. Deliberately. And Frank walked back to the bar. The beer he poured was exact to the rim, cold, crisp, no spill. He placed it gently in front of Jack's with both hands, then took 3 steps back and stood at attention. No words. Just presence. Around the room, patrons watched. No one dared to speak. Some lowered their heads. Some just watched Jack's, trying to read the unreadable lines in his expression. Then Jack's did something no one expected. He nodded. Not a big gesture. Not theatrical. Just a single, quiet acknowledgement, "I see you." Frank exhaled for the first time all day. Outside, the wind shifted. In the distance, the American flag clinked softly against the pole as the sun fell below the waterline. Inside the salty Gaul, for the first time in its history, everyone felt welcome. And Jack's? He didn't finish the beer. He didn't need to. He left it half full. Like the beginning of something. Jack stood slowly, leaving behind the half-finished beer on the table as if it were a monument. Not to thirst, but to dignity. His movement was quiet, deliberate. No parting glance. No dramatics. Just a man who had reclaimed space with nothing more than presence. As he approached the door, Reaper stepped in from the sidewalk. He hadn't come to inspect. He hadn't come to supervise. He came to stand by his brother, not behind, not in front, just beside. He placed a steady hand on Jax's shoulder. No words passed between them, but in that touch was a conversation only men forged by fire could understand. And then they left, one after the other. Jax didn't pay with a card. He dropped 2 $20 bills on the table and didn't wait for change. When Frank instinctively reached for the cash, Reaper gave him a single shake of the head. "Don't," he said. "That's part of his honor. Don't try to pay it back. Just carry it." Frank froze. From that moment on, something shifted. The Salty Gaul wasn't just a bar anymore. It was a lesson carved into wood and glass and silence. A place where people lowered their voices, not from fear, but from respect. Where looks were exchanged with acknowledgement, not suspicion. Where race didn't define service, and silence didn't imply danger. Within 3 days, the story spread across Port City like fire in dry grass. Not from the press, no journalist had written a word. Not from hashtags or TikToks. Just whispers. One man told another. A barber told a mechanic. A fisherman told a vendor. And soon, everyone knew. A black soldier was kicked out for being too quiet. The next day, his entire SEAL team walked in. And changed everything. At first, there was confusion. Then awe. Then a kind of awakening. Men who once mocked the notion of sensitivity stopped speaking so fast. Women who had watched injustice their whole lives finally saw a moment when justice didn't shout, it simply stood up. One of the regulars, a gruff, white-haired dockworker named Leo, sat at the bar a week later, sipping whiskey slowly. "You know," he muttered to Frank, "I used to think I had this place figured out. Thought we all knew who belonged and who didn't." Frank wiped the bar without looking at him. "And now?" he asked. Leo tapped his glass, thoughtful. "Now I know who should be welcomed. The quiet ones. The ones who've done the work." Frank nodded. Not with pride. But with humility. A week after Jax's return, Frank made a decision. Quietly, without announcement, he took the old American flag down from the wall. Not out of shame, but to do something better. He had it folded properly, military style, and placed inside a wooden shadow box with a brass plate that read, "To those who fought. So even those who judge them can sleep in peace." Next to it, he framed the letter he had written to Jax, the original paper, stained slightly from the sweat of his trembling hands. He didn't expect anyone to read it. He didn't even label it. He just put it there as proof that transformation could happen, one page at a time. And above that, Frank did one last thing. He hung a photo. Not a glossy portrait. Not a posed shot. Just a quiet, candid photo of Jack sitting at the table, hand around the beer glass, eyes looking out the window. Framed in simple black. No words. No caption. When asked about it, Frank would simply say, "That man changed everything," without raising his voice. Tourists started coming in because of the story. Veterans from all over visited just to see the place. Some cried. Some saluted. Some just sat in silence and drank a beer they knew they finally had the right to enjoy without explanation. And slowly, even Frank changed, not in speeches, but in habits. He learned to listen more. He hired a new staff member, a young black Marine Corps vet named Evan. Not out of guilt, but out of responsibility. He offered free drinks to veterans on Fridays, but more importantly, he shook their hands, looked them in the eyes, and said, "Thank you. Not just for your service, but for showing up." One night, a high school kid from out of town stepped into the Salty Gull. He wore a junior ROTC patch on his hoodie and had a nervous energy about him. He pointed to the photo of Jack's on the wall. "Is that him?" he asked. Frank nodded. "Yeah." The kid swallowed. "He's the one from the story, right?" Frank set down the glass he was drying and said, "Yeah. He's the one." The boy lingered, eyes glued to the image. "What did he do after you kicked him out?" Frank looked at the boy, then glanced up at the photo again. "He didn't yell," Frank said. "Didn't fight. Just walked out with his pride intact." "Then what happened?" Frank smiled, "Just barely. His brothers showed up, and taught me how to be a man." The boy stood a little straighter after that. And when he left, he whispered to the photo, "Thanks." Meanwhile, Ghost Pack never told their side of the story publicly. There were no interviews. No books. No press. Because they didn't need validation. They were the validation. And Jack's? He didn't return every week. But every now and then, on quiet afternoons when the light was just right, he'd walk through that door, order a beer, and sit in that same corner. No fuss. No drama. And this time, no one dared tell him he didn't belong. Because now, he did. Not because the town allowed it. But because he had claimed it with nothing but quiet, still defiance, and a brotherhood that never left anyone behind. On the last Saturday of the month, Frank Delaney stood outside the Salty Gull just before opening, holding a small box in his hands. Inside was a folded American flag, pristine and untouched, gifted to him by a retired Coast Guard officer who had heard the story and driven 3 hours just to shake Frank's hand. But Frank didn't hang it. Instead, he placed it on a new shelf he had built above the register, a space he had cleared by removing the old photos of himself with celebrity patrons and fishing trophies. That space now belonged to something else entirely. He placed the folded flag carefully, and beside it, a single brass plaque that read, "In honor of those who serve silently." Then he turned on the lights, unlocked the door, and waited. Across town, Jack stood on a pier overlooking the water. He'd begun walking this route each morning. It helped clear the noise in his head, the kind most people never heard. The battles after the war. The ones without gunfire, but full of assumptions, judgments, and invisible barriers. He hadn't expected to come back to the Salty Gull after that first visit. He'd said his piece. He'd left his silence. But when Reaper texted him a photo of the flag on the new shelf, he paused. Not because it changed everything, but because it showed something had started to change. And sometimes, that's enough. He turned from the pier and walked back toward town. Back at the Salty Gull, a group of veterans had begun meeting every Friday evening. They called it Last Call Roll Call. No official club. No dues. Just a table always kept clear. An open chair. One beer poured and left untouched, in case someone needed it. Sometimes it stayed full all night. Sometimes, like that Friday, someone unexpected filled the seat. A tall, quiet figure stepped through the door. No announcement. Just presence. His cap shadowed his eyes, his shirt still the same gray. Jax walked in, nodded at the bar, and took the open seat at the veterans' table. No one clapped. No one cheered. But several men subtly straightened their backs. One woman, a Navy vet named Carla, raised her glass just slightly. Jax returned the gesture. He didn't talk much that night. But when a young soldier named Luis, just back from deployment, nervously asked him, "How do you handle it, sir?" All the looks, the questions. Jax didn't blink. "I don't," he said softly. "I just show up anyway." Those words hit the table like a dropped rifle. Not heavy, but important. Final. Frank, standing behind the bar, heard every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't insert himself. He had learned the power of restraint. The power of watching without assuming. Listening without responding. He had learned that real respect doesn't start with action. It starts with surrendering ego. That night, after the last roll call disbanded, Jax stood to leave. As he turned toward the door, Frank called out, not loud, not commanding, just enough to carry. "Hey, Jax." Jax stopped. Frank held something in his hands. A worn baseball cap, Jax's old one, left behind by accident after that first night he was kicked out. Frank had kept it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. He walked over and handed it back with both hands. "I think this belongs to you," he said. Jax took it, looked down, then placed it back on his head. "Thanks," he said. Then added, "You kept it safe." Frank nodded. "It reminded me how to be better." Jax looked around the room, the tables, the faces, some familiar, some new. And in a soft voice, not to Frank, not to the bar, but to the space itself, he said, "This is what the fight was for." And he walked out. Days passed. Weeks, even. And while the world outside Port City kept moving, outrage cycles, headlines, hashtags, something steady had settled inside the Salty Gull. Local teachers came in just to sit near the veterans' table. Barbers and mechanics started offering discounts to those with military IDs, not for marketing, but out of sincerity. And once, a young black student named Miles walked in with his father and pointed to Jax's photo. "That's the guy who made the whole town listen, right?" His father, eyes misty, replied, "No, son. He's the guy who made the town change." One rainy afternoon, Frank received a letter. Handwritten. Mailed, not emailed. No return address. He unfolded it. "Frank. I don't walk in for praise. I walk in because I believe people can grow. You grew. That matters. Keep going. J." Frank read it twice. Then he placed it in a frame. Right below the photo of Jax. He didn't brag about it. Didn't mention it to customers. But every now and then, he'd glance at it. And every time he did, he felt the quiet weight of being better than the man he used to be. And that weight? He carried it gladly. A full year had passed since that unforgettable afternoon at the Salty Gull. The bar looked much the same, wooden walls soaked in decades of beer, salt, and old stories, but the air was different now. Sharper. Cleaner. Like the kind of place where stories weren't just told, but remembered. On the outside, the changes were small. No massive renovations. No banners or billboards. But inside? Inside, the Salty Gull had become something else entirely. There was a rhythm now. Every first Friday of the month, without announcement, the ghost pack returned, not always all 12, not always in uniform, but always together. Sometimes Reaper walked in alone. Sometimes it was Bricks or Tank or Smoke. They didn't drink much. They didn't say much. But their presence kept the place honest. And every time they did, Frank made sure he wasn't just serving beer, he was serving respect. That particular evening, a woman named Denise stood at the bar. She'd been watching for a while, watching the way people treated Jax when he walked in, watching how Frank offered his hand first now, not out of obligation but out of genuine humility. Denise finally leaned forward and asked, "You ever tell the full story? The whole thing?" Frank glanced at the framed letter behind the bar. The photo of Jax. The folded flag. The untouched beer that always sat at the veterans' table. "No," he said. "Not my story to tell." "But you lived it," she said gently. Frank shook his head. "I witnessed it. There's a difference." Denise nodded, understanding. She didn't press. She just raised her glass to Jax's photo and toasted silently. And somewhere outside, beneath the wide port city sky, Jax sat by the docks alone, as he often did. The waves whispered under the wooden planks. He could hear the gulls calling, the ships clinking against their moorings, and a wind that tasted of brine and memory. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, faded at the edges. It showed his original SEAL team in Afghanistan, all of them young, hardened, half-smiling through the dust. Some of them were gone now. Others scattered across the country. But one thing had never changed, the bond. The moment he had sent that message, the simple report about being kicked out of a bar, he hadn't expected action. He hadn't even expected acknowledgement. But the next day, they'd shown up. And in doing so, they reminded a whole town what loyalty looked like. He looked down at the photo again. His fingers brushed lightly over a figure in the back row, Reaper, standing tall as ever. Then he looked up toward the sea and spoke softly to no one. "You never stand alone, even when you sit in silence." Back at the bar, Frank was finishing up for the night. The last customers filtered out. The lights dimmed. The soft jazz he played during closing time echoed gently under the rafters. And then came a knock. Frank turned and opened the door. Jax stood there, cap in hand. "I just came to say something," Jax said quietly. Frank stepped aside. "You never need an invitation here." Jax walked in slowly. The place was empty now, save for the quiet hum of the fridge and the flicker of the neon sign in the window. He walked to the veterans' table and looked at the seat where his untouched beer usually sat. Then he turned to Frank. "I'm not just coming back for peace anymore," he said. "I'm coming back because this place finally feels like it remembers who it's for." Frank nodded, throat tight. "It's for you. Always has been. I just didn't know it back then." They stood in silence for a while. Then Jack smiled, not wide, not showy. "Just enough." "I was wrong about something," he said. Frank raised a brow. "About what?" Jax gestured to the photo wall. "I thought the fight was out there, overseas, behind enemy lines. But it's here, too. It's every room where someone's told they don't belong. And sometimes, winning means not walking away." Frank leaned against the counter. "You think we've won?" Jax thought for a moment. Then shrugged. "Maybe not the war. But a battle? Yeah. And this time, we won it without firing a shot." They both chuckled quietly. Then Jax turned to leave. Before he opened the door, he paused. "You know what the real difference is, Frank?" "What?" "You finally understood that hanging a flag means nothing, unless the people who bled for it can walk beneath it without looking over their shoulder." Frank nodded, voice barely a whisper. "I understand that now." Jax opened the door, stepped into the cool night air, and vanished into the shadows of Port City. From that day on, the Salty Gull remained what it had become, not a sanctuary, not a spectacle, but something better. A place where silence was not feared. Where presence was power. Where respect didn't have to be earned through pain, but was given because it was owed. No headlines. No reporters. No medals. Just a table. A flag. And a man who sat down and never had to stand alone again. Some stories change a room. Others change a town. But a few, like this one, change the way we understand each other. Jerome Maulister didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand justice. He embodied it. And in doing so, reminded all of us that sometimes, the loudest statement is made in silence. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think, or maybe just feel something real, please share it. Comment below. And subscribe to True Echo for more stories of dignity, courage, and quiet revolution. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do, is simply refuse to disappear.